So today I'll be just sharing some of the emerging insights from the PhD that I'm doing at the moment. Looking at the psychosocial dimensions, meaning the social and psychological processes or really dimensions that get involved in landscape-based rehabilitation projects. This is typically what the kind of diagrams you see when you look into literature around how to change systems, including psycho-ecological systems. And these are kind of examples where people are trying to combine the literature from social sciences and then ecology or system science in, what kind of parts of the system can actually help to bring about change. Now, mostly in conservation and in restoration or rehabilitation work, we tend to focus on that behavioral technical side. Sorry, just skipped. And that's also how success in projects get defined. However, that overlooks your power dynamics, rules, the roles of rules and norms, and of course, your beliefs, your values, and your paradigms embedded within you. And those can be very influential and very powerful in changing systems. But as I said, at the moment, it's not really yet looked at. And we've mentioned this now a few times already today. And this is also a typical kind of diagram you can find that helps to explain to you how does the ecological side, of course the social side, and these systems work together. And I can see from the frowning faces in the audience, a lot of you also feel like this, which is how I felt a few years ago, where there are a lot of very interesting, very useful ideas in literature, but what do I do with this when facing a landscape like that? How do I actually implement these ideas? So my research is essentially in partnership with Living Lands, which is a not-for-profit company based mostly in South Africa, and then their partner Common Land based in the Netherlands. And I'm specifically focusing on the rehabilitation work that they're doing in the Eastern Cape, in the Baviaanskloof, and in the Langkloof, which is a UNESCO heritage site. So what makes this unique, or not unique, but interesting, is that Common Land has what they call a 4 returns framework and how they're defining what impact they want to see in the landscapes for the projects that they support. And they, of course, look at natural capital and they look at financial capital, meaning sustainable businesses. And they look, of course, at social capital. And then they also have this thing called return on inspiration. Basically, they aim or aspire to create a sense of hope and a sense of purpose in these landscapes that they're also working with. But the question comes in, how do you implement a framework like that in landscapes such as in South Africa, which are quite complex, lots of uncertainty and very contested, meaning there are a lot of different needs and a lot of conflicts as well? So for my research, just to mention, it's mostly qualitative at the moment, meaning I'm going through a lot of reports, doing a lot of document analysis, and also just hanging out with people in the communities and speaking to various stakeholders involved. And today, I will be presenting, this is just an overview of the whole project, but I'll speak a little bit about this idea of, how do you frame this framework in a landscape to match it to the context, the who and the what. Then moving into implementation. So what kind of approach can you use to actually implement this kind of framework? And then a little bit into this area of evaluation and monitoring. So how do you actually evaluate and monitor this kind of impact? So firstly, I want to unpack a little bit or share some insights from the literature review that I had to do. Because that 4 returns framework and the kind of ways we've been speaking to about how socio-ecological systems work and how that impact is framed, it can look deceptively simple of what you're actually trying to do. And if you go and dig a little deeper, you, for example, realize that firstly, in a framework like that, you're actually working with, let's say, 4 different dimensions or ways of looking at reality. And that's now, of course, your objective, which is very clearly what you can empirically observe. Your inter-objective, which is more like your systems, the relationship between objects. Then intersubjective, which is the relationship more between people. So that's, for example, where culture comes in and ideas. And there's also the subjective, which of course is your own internal experiences and feelings. So the point is basically that that 4 returns framework is actually asking you to look at all of these different dimensions. Then you also have, of course, people attribute different values to landscapes. And this is an example of all the different values, of course, that you find in restoring landscapes. You, of course, have your ecological value, but then also socioeconomic, cultural value, and also that personal value. Some people are involved in rehabilitation or restoration because it gives them a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose. Then on top of that, you, of course, have sustainability, which also looks at all of these different types of capitals. And then there are ways that you can look at a landscape in, again, different ways. For example, your matterscape, which looks at the physical features. Some people call this the powerscape, which is more your culture and your power dynamics and your norms. And of course, the mindscape, which is more your internal experience, interpretation, and meaning of this landscape. And then we go right back there to how landscapes or systems actually transform. We again have that practical dimension, your political dimension, and then that personal dimension, where your paradigms and your values are. So all of that gets packed into this framework. So that's quite a lot. And it does also then raise this question of, beyond just looking at the surface level of what those capitals mean, you also need to, if you especially move into implementation, evaluation, need to ask, in approaching this complexity, what's going to work for whom, in what context, how, why, and who gets to decide. As a very short example here is that today I'm not going to talk about indicators yet, because at the moment, the project that I'm working on, we're still figuring out, look, we can go into literature and to look at all the wonderful examples of how to measure trust. But the organization may not necessarily have the capacity to go and do surveys every few months to go measure trust. And the people you're working with may also not like to be asked a little Likert statement every few months, especially in landscapes where people have been subjected to a lot of previous research and can become very resistant. So how then do you actually monitor the level of trust that you have in the community? And the next part, I'm just going to talk a little bit about of taking that question forward and how can you potentially actually now implement a framework like that, or at least start engaging with those different dimensions. Because the other tricky part is that you can't just do the one and then the others will happen automatically. You need to do all of them at the same time. So that's quite a tall order. So the project that I'm working with are basically using what they call, or what is called, a relational approach, and how to actually implement this framework. This basically comes down to creating what some authors call a bottom-up patchwork approach of creating relationships with different people in the landscape as an alternative to seeking consensus, meaning that you're not from the start trying to get representatives of the different groups into one room and trying to get an agreement of what we're going to do. You start rather with identifying who are the different people and the different needs in the landscape and engaging with each of them and building a relationship with each of them as a starting point, which of course then links to learning and then hopefully starting to create links between these different groups as well. And of course, there's also links to existing concepts such as sense of place, it's really all about creating connections between individuals, between different community members, and of course, people with their place. So that's a little bit more of the theory stuff and how it gets described. Now, what this looks like in reality, at least in this case study, it means that as an organization, you need to have what I would call a spatial commitment and a time commitment, meaning that members of this program or this project are living in the landscape. They don't come in for a few weeks and then leave. They live there. They're also there for a long time. I think the case study has now been in those landscapes for more than 10 years now. Other things also is that the impact is very individual based, meaning that it's small and deep. So you're not having workshops where every time 50 new people come. it's the same person that you're working with over a long period of time. So it also gets very personally involved. And that can be very rewarding, of course, for both the people working in the project and the people that they're working with. It also involves doing work that's beyond the project work. That means it's not, you need to do stuff that doesn't typically get captured in the normal project work. And this can be stuff like doing a favor for someone, or helping a community member with some administrative issues because they don't quite understand how to fill in a form. These kind of like very little things, but they add up. It also means that you need to be very strategic about the proposals or the projects that you apply for funding for, because you can't just, because you're there for long term and you're working with this long process, you can't just jump from the one thing to the other one. There needs to be some kind of continuity and plan, meaning you're also doing a lot of maintenance work for the rehabilitation. Now, the challenges come in that with that spatial commitment of being in the landscape, it's sometimes very difficult to find people who are willing to live in those landscapes because they are remote and very challenging, which is why you have your project there. You're also in the landscape for long enough to live with the consequences of your failures. So it's not this typical thing of when a project gets done, you go away for after 3 years, and then you don't need to deal with the fact that, let's say, all the plants that you've planted have now died and nothing has actually changed. You need to keep on looking these people in the eye. Then also with the individual-based one is you are subjected to personal burnout, the ups and downs of having a relationship with human beings. And you also have this tension between quality and quantity. Because the moment you're trying to go to contact more and more people, you may lose some of that depth. But if you also only focus on that depth, you end up only working with 5 people in the landscape. Doing work that goes beyond the normal project can also mean you can have a little bit of identity crisis. For example, some of the stuff that's come up in the research so far is we're an environmental organization, but we look like a social organization or a community organization, which for some people can be quite a struggle. The other thing that also come in is that even though you can be in the landscape for a very long time and you think you've shown a lot of commitment to becoming part of the community, you can still be seen as an outsider by the people living in the community, which can, of course, be very discouraging. And also, funders may get bored with you because you're not chasing the newest buzzword and you keep on doing the same thing over and over again. Now, in ecological reputation, a lot of that work is the boring stuff that you need to do, the same thing over and over again. But it's difficult then to follow the fashions in funding. Okay, so that was now a little bit of perspective on you as the initiative or organization during the implementation, and now stepping a little bit more internal about moving into the space of how do you actually monitor and evaluate with all this complexity in these kind of frameworks. Now, working in a complex and contested space like these landscapes are, it does seem that to some extent for organizations like that, you are required to actually have what we call like an organization of individuals. And then ironically, because you're an organization working in a complex environment that you need to be quite autonomous and make decisions, because you aren't able to do your structured monitoring evaluation, you don't know your impact, which then actually undermines your autonomy and your sense of purpose. So we're still trying to figure out how to address this issue, but it is a little bit of a reality of when you're working in these complex areas, and on one side you need to be quite creative and flexible, yet at the same time some kind of structure to actually monitor what is happening, so you don't come to the end of the day where you know you've done a lot of stuff, but you have no indication of actually what's happening. So part of what the lesson has been here and that we are looking at the moment is that moving the focus away when it comes to monitoring evaluation of just looking at creating frameworks and protocols and lists of indicators for like project management, but actually look into what is called change management, which comes more from the business organization management side of things, but it's essentially about if you want to bring about a change in organization, like adopting a new monitoring evaluation system, you actually need to go through quite a deep cultural and personal change there as well. So you need to actually engage the organization's culture and not just on the surface level, the structures and the processes. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.